Crazy stuff. Crazy
Yep.
stuff. Anyway, talking about our catalogue of assassinations of recent years, just to sort of start ringing in the coincidences and the similarities between them. 1965 is our next stop. Malcolm X, also known as Malcolm Little, was an American black Muslim minister. He's often seen as the man behind the Black Power movement of the 1960s and 1970s, in which African Americans are radicalised and became driven towards freedom and towards gaining the respect of their fellow Americans. Malcolm had previously been a member of the Nation of Islam. However, he had become a Sunni Muslim. Apparently, following this, the Nation of Islam had given orders for the assassination of Malcolm X. On the 21st of February 1965, Malcolm had begun giving a speech when a man rushed through the crowd and shot Malcolm X with a sawn-off shotgun. 2 other men joined in, and Malcolm was shot a total of 16 times. The 3 men who killed Malcolm X were all members of the Nation of Islam. Despite often being labelled as a cold-hearted radical and a menace, the world was sympathetic towards Malcolm following his assassination, being killed at the age of 39. And my cynicism immediately looks at this information and and my first thought is, do we know for sure that these 3 people, were all members of the Nation of Islam?
Well, you got the right man on here, because a secret I have, is a hobby of mine, is I'm something of a Malcolm X nerd. I'm fascinated by the man. I'm fascinated by his life story. I'm fascinated by the effects and the seismic effects his assassination and life had on the United States. In many ways were even bigger than Kennedy. Mm-hmm. Now, what happened in the Audubon ballroom was not expected. If you look and read into what was going on in the final days leading up to the assassination, he was very public in his hatred of Elijah Muhammad at the head of the Nation of Islam. One of his last major press statements was he was basically they were character assassinating each other through the press. Mm-hmm. He talked about Elijah Muhammad having 6 illegitimate children from 8 women, 8 teenage girls, when he was in his 60s and 70s, which is absolutely true. Yep. Now, one of the defining moments in all this is that Muhammad Ali, then Cassius Clay, when he became the heavyweight champion of the world, he was brought into the Nation of Islam by Malcolm X. What happened then was the split became so big at that point that Malcolm X was not allowed into the conference that the nation had that year. I think it was in Chicago, and they indoctrinated Cassius Clay, Muhammad Ali, into the nation. Now, this was a huge snub, and if you look at Muhammad Ali, you can see he's clearly mind controlled. I've no doubt that the Nation of Islam was absolutely a cult that worked in every way, and Malcolm X had broken his programming. Now, why this is so important to the United States government is Malcolm X was only an asset as long as he remained in the Nation of Islam, because he was still inside. Did you know the Nation of Islam is actually a flying saucer cult? A lot of people don't know that.
Really?
But their fundamental tenet is that the nation arrived in a $1 million spaceship made of gold, which landed in Japan.
Goodness.
So people don't know this. And as long as he was inside the nation, he was safe, because he could always be tagged with the radical thing. Yep. He signed his death warrant when he broke from the nation and went off and became basically a straightforward Muslim. That's when the US government took very big interest in him. They followed him to Cairo, they followed him all around Africa. He was heavily involved in pan-nationalism in Africa, in the same way Gaddafi was. Right. He was traveling through all the African capitals, and it was the same thing. He was heavily involved, and this was at the point where Africa was still relatively peaceful. It hadn't descended into the actual mayhem it did from the late 1960s or the mid-1960s with Biafra on. Malcolm X was extremely dangerous to many business interests who had assets within Africa, but also he was deliberately telling black men not to join the U.S. military. He was also very critical of the policies of Martin Luther King. So when he came out of the Nation of Islam, he was a marked man. The 3 assassins in the ballroom who took him out that day, I absolutely do believe they were members of the Nation of Islam, and I will say that they were federal agents operating inside the nation.
Right. More plants, more friendly fire, effectively. It's 9:15 p.m. here in central Peterborough in the United Kingdom, and Red Alert Radio is here, me, Alex G, and with me is Thomas Sheridan. Thomas, we were talking about Malcolm X before the break, and you said something very intriguing, that he was at odds with Martin Luther King. I really must have that explained to me. I wasn't aware of that at all.
In the it's interesting. The two of them kind of took over each other's job. It was very strange. Now, in the early days when Martin Luther King's, I think it was the Association of Bandsmen of Colored People, was taking off, or the American Negro League too, was taking off and becoming the main civil rights body for African Americans in the United States. Yeah. Martin Luther King was preaching this kind of Gandhi-esque non-violence thing, and it was very, very successful, and it tied in very well with the kind of liberals. The liberals were very happy with that, the sort of emerging liberal kind of class in the United States that had emerged in the wake of the Kennedy assassination. Now, Martin Luther King was called horrific names by Malcolm X in the early days. Remember, Malcolm Little was basically a street thug. So he spoke with that kind of language. He was calling him an Uncle Tom and a house, N-word, and so on. Yeah. And it was very, very nasty. And he said he was, he would never get out. And I know there's an element of truth to that. I don't mean to denigrate the name of Martin Luther King, but Martin Luther King was preaching this kind of peaceful non-violence idea for black nationalism in the United States. But what happened got very interesting again. After Malcolm X was assassinated, Martin Luther King flipped, and he was talking about war, he was talking about getting armed, he was talking about developing a militia based on the fruit of Islam, which was a sort of a paramilitary group that was within the Nation of Islam. He wanted a non-secular version of that. Now, his assassination was definitely done by the CIA or the feds, and it's clear as day. James Earl Ray had nothing to do with the assassination of Martin Luther King. The guy couldn't even hold a gun. He'd never fired a gun. He was just some sort of like loser they pulled off the street, blamed him with the assassination, and next thing you know, he spends the rest of his life in prison. In fact, when he died, the Martin Luther King family attended his funeral. They did not believe that he was involved in the assassination. And also the United States government reopened the Martin Luther King case and found, similar to the Guyana case in Britain, that it wasn't what they said it was. Now, an interesting one about that, I forgot what I was going to say then. Oh, yes, the Martin Luther King and then the Malcolm X assassination bring up two very interesting similarities. Mm-hmm. Prior to their assassination, two sort of charismatic characters who came out of nowhere were pushed into the lead role. One was the Reverend Jesse Jackson, and the other one was Louis Farrakhan, who became the leader of the Nation of Islam, both of whom seemed to be slotted into positions of power, ready to go, as if they were had been aware that this was going to be their next role. So again, these are very interesting characters. I don't really particularly like either one of them as people. They seem to have been almost created to fill the role of the assassinated Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, and replace it with somebody who was more agreeable to the control structure or the psychopathic control grid. Farrakhan was a Nation of Islam hardcore traditionalist, while Jesse Jackson was the ultimate liberal figure.
I mean, it's a Blue Peter moment, isn't it? Here's two that we made earlier from the sound of it.
Precisely, yeah.